In 2025, the United States is not outside the pattern that destroyed three superpowers in the last 500 years. It is moving through it, stage by stage, decision by decision, executing a sequence that has already played out before. In 1590, Spain stood at the top of the world, and they controlled half the world's gold and silver. Their military dominated Europe. Their currency was accepted everywhere, and no rival could challenge them directly. Within 80 years, they were bankrupt, reduced to a second-rate power that never recovered. And once that status was lost, it did not return with a single victory or a single reform, because the position that paid for their reach had already been spent. In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. The sun never set on British territory. The pound sterling anchored global trade, and London financed the world. Within 40 years, the empire was gone. The currency had collapsed, and Britain stood behind America rather than ahead of it, with the old margin for independent action replaced by dependence on a new creditor. In 1991, the Soviet Union, armed with nuclear weapons and global influence, ceased to exist in 900 days. Not from invasion, not from defeat in battle, but from economic implosion. And when the money mechanism broke, there was no slower off-ramp left to take. Three superpowers, three collapses, and each followed the same sequence, even as they insisted they were different. What should unsettle you is not that collapse has happened before. It is that the United States has already completed 5 of the 7 stages that preceded those collapses, which means the remaining stages do not arrive as debates, but as constraints that appear after options have already been traded away. We are not approaching the pattern. We are deep inside it. And history shows that once a superpower reaches this depth, the illusion of control evaporates faster than anyone expects, because the system begins reacting to prior commitments instead of choosing freely. Imperial collapse does not begin with an enemy crossing a border. It begins with economic exhaustion that leaders refuse to name. And once exhaustion becomes the operating condition, every new promise is made by borrowing against flexibility the system no longer has. An empire extends itself beyond what it can sustain, builds bases in distant lands, fights wars on multiple fronts, makes promises to allies and to its own citizens that outpace the resources available to honor them. At first, nothing appears broken. The currency still circulates, the military still projects power, the government still passes budgets and announces new commitments. But beneath the surface, the foundation cracks. Resources are misallocated, productive capacity shrinks, and the talented drift away or disengage. The decline is invisible until the cost of ignoring it becomes irreversible, and after that point, the empire is no longer deciding whether to change, it is deciding which bills to pay first. Then, acceleration arrives without warning. Allies hedge their bets and enemies test boundaries while trade partners seek alternatives. The reserve currency status that once guaranteed demand begins to erode. And once erosion begins, the empire can no longer rely on automatic external financing to cover internal strain. The advantages that made the empire dominant become liabilities, and the currency that once flowed outward in demand floods back home, and the global military footprint that once symbolized strength becomes a budgetary trap. Promises once backed by unquestioned power begin to sound hollow, and the moment they sound hollow, the cost of proving them rises beyond what the finances can comfortably absorb. Spain learned this. Britain learned this. The Soviet Union learned this. Each believed permanence was their birthright. Each extended militarily, debased currency, accumulated debt, and refused to accept reality until the system was already unraveling. And once unraveling started, the remaining moves were no longer about rebuilding strength, but about postponing recognition. Spain provides the original blueprint. After 1492, gold and silver from the Americas poured into Spanish coffers, and by 1550, 200 tons of silver arrived annually. By 1600, more than 400 tons. Spain effectively controlled Europe's money supply, and the Spanish real became the reserve currency of its age. King Philip II, ruling from 1556 to 1598, possessed more wealth than any monarch before him, and he chose empire over restraint, converting a temporary advantage into a permanent obligation. With that decision, Stage 1 began. And once Stage 1 began, the empire's survival depended on continuing to fund commitments that could not be unwound without admitting weakness. Spain fought everywhere at once: the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, France and Italian states in Europe, Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, England's navy at sea, conflicts in the Philippines and the Americas. By 1580, Spain had military commitments on 4 continents, and half of state revenue went to the military, and still it was insufficient. The empire did not reduce commitments, it borrowed to sustain them, closing the door on retrenchment and binding future revenue to past decisions. And that binding meant each new year began with less freedom than the year before. Once borrowing became the bridge, stopping would have forced immediate contraction. So the empire kept walking forward, because turning back became the more expensive move. And after that bridge was chosen, contraction became more expensive than expansion. Taxes could not cover the cost, so Stage 2 followed. The crown debased the currency, and copper was mixed into silver coins. 50% copper became 75% copper. The face value remained unchanged, but the intrinsic value collapsed. Merchants responded by discounting the coins, and inflation surged. The crown did not reverse course. It doubled down, because admitting the loss would have meant admitting the limits of empire. And once the currency's integrity was sacrificed, the state lost the ability to restore trust quickly. The next constraint arrived immediately, because a debased coin forced higher nominal payments for the same real purchases, which meant the military and the bureaucracy demanded more money just to stand still. Stage 3 locked the trap. Spain borrowed from Italian bankers, German bankers, anyone willing to extend credit, and by 1557, less than 20 years into Philip's reign, Spain declared bankruptcy. It restructured and resumed borrowing. Bankruptcy came again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. 4 defaults in 40 years. Each time reforms were promised, and each time military spending resumed. Each default narrowed options, because creditors demanded more control and higher returns, while the empire required more cash simply to function. And after each default, the empire lost the option of borrowing cheaply. The downstream constraint was immediate. The same war machine now required larger inflows to compensate for damaged credibility. So even stability became more expensive than before. Stage 4 removed the productive base. The flood of silver eliminated urgency, and once urgency disappeared, rebuilding capacity stopped being a priority and started being a luxury nobody funded. Why grow food when imports could be purchased? Why build ships domestically when foreign yards could supply them? Nobility considered work beneath them, and manufacturing declined and agriculture stagnated. Wealth flowed through Spain but did not stay. Gold and silver paid for French wine, Italian silk, Dutch goods. Spain became a conduit rather than a producer, and by 1600 production had hollowed out. When silver output declined, there was no domestic engine to compensate. The empire had traded capability for convenience, and that trade could not be reversed quickly enough to matter, which meant the next shortage could not be solved by internal expansion and had to be met by external payments the state was already struggling to make. Stage 5 followed as consequence, not cause, and with economic failure came social decay, and crime rose. Beggars filled Madrid. The productive emigrated, and talent moved to France, England, the Netherlands. Spain was left with bureaucrats, soldiers, and clergy consuming what no one created. And once the productive left, the tax base shrank while the obligation base remained. By 1640, Portugal broke away, and by 1650, the Netherlands was lost. By 1700, the empire remained on maps but not in power, and Spain never recovered its former status. The first global superpower became a regional state, its dominance a memory sustained in museums and architecture, rather than in markets or military reach. And the constraint that remained was permanent. Without a productive core, every attempt at resurgence relied on money they no longer controlled. 3 centuries later, Britain stood at a similar crossroads. At its peak, it controlled a quarter of the world's land surface and governed 400 million subjects. The pound sterling denominated global trade, and central banks held British bonds. London set financial terms. Like Spain, Britain assumed permanence, and that assumption pushed decisions that made retreat politically impossible, even when it became financially required. But the pattern had already begun, and once begun, the empire's choices narrowed to preserving the image or preserving the balance sheet. By 1900, Britain defended commitments on 6 continents: India, Africa, the Middle East, China, the Pacific, the Caribbean, and the cost mounted. But retreat was politically unthinkable, and the longer that posture held, the more any reduction would have signaled weakness to both rivals and subjects. In 1914, World War I forced a decision: remain neutral and preserve finances, or enter the war and risk bankruptcy to maintain dominance. Britain chose war. The conflict cost over $40 billion, roughly $1 trillion in today's terms, and to pay, Britain borrowed heavily from the United States. The creditor became the debtor, a shift in leverage that could not be undone by battlefield victory. And once the leverage flipped, Britain lost the option of funding empire on its own terms. The immediate constraint followed. Interest and repayment became a standing claim on future policy, so post-war recovery began already pre-committed. The war ended, but the financial damage remained. Gold reserves had been shipped to America to pay for supplies. In 1925, Britain attempted to restore the pound to its pre-war gold parity. That decision overvalued the currency, and exports became expensive, while manufacturing declined and unemployment rose. And once unemployment rose, the domestic political window for austerity narrowed, even as the external window for devaluation remained closed by pride. To defend the pound, interest rates remained high, crushing domestic growth, and by 1931 the pressure broke. Britain abandoned the gold standard, and the pound lost a quarter of its value overnight. The reserve currency had conceded it could not keep its promise, and once conceded, confidence was not restored by declaration. The next constraint arrived immediately. A cheaper pound raised the cost of imports and forced harsher trade-offs at home, while the empire still demanded resources abroad. Debt did not disappear. World War II began and added another $120 billion in costs. More borrowing from America. By 1945, Britain owed the United States and Canada sums exceeding its entire GDP. Victory came, but empire became unaffordable. And once unaffordable, the empire stopped being a strategic choice and became a liquidation problem. In 1947, India was relinquished, and over the next 2 decades, colonies fell away. The empire dissolved not because Britain wished it so, but because it could no longer finance or defend it. And once the withdrawal started, the remaining holdings became harder to justify and more expensive to secure. The downstream constraint was immediate. Each loss reduced revenue and reach, which forced the next loss to come sooner because the base supporting the whole structure kept shrinking. After that first withdrawal, Britain could no longer pause the unwind without paying more to hold less, because every remaining possession had to be defended with a budget already shrinking. The currency continued its descent, from $4.03 per pound in 1940 to $2.80 in 1950, to $2.40 in 1970, to $2.30 in 1980, and lower still thereafter. The global reserve currency became regional. Britain retained symbols of influence, a seat on the UN Security Council, nuclear weapons, a special relationship with America. But the leverage had shifted. And once leverage shifted, those symbols could not buy back autonomy. The empire did not return. It could not, because the economic base required to sustain it had been spent defending its illusion. And what became impossible next was simple. Britain could no longer set global financial terms without first securing approval from markets it no longer dominated. The Soviet Union entered the pattern under different ideology but identical constraint, and after 1945 it emerged as a superpower with nuclear weapons and control over Eastern Europe. For decades it matched American military output, but that decision carried cost. And once the cost structure was fixed, the state could not reduce spending without admitting weakness to both allies and rivals. Military spending consumed 15 to 20% of GDP, triple the American share. The Soviet economy was smaller, yet it attempted parity across continents: Afghanistan, Cuba, Syria, Vietnam, North Korea, Angola, Ethiopia. Influence had to be countered everywhere. The choice to compete everywhere closed the option of fiscal balance, and the immediate downstream constraint followed. Every domestic shortfall became permanent because resources were already committed to external contest. By the 1970s, economic growth stalled. Oil revenues masked stagnation but did not repair structural weakness. Factories produced inferior goods and farms underperformed. Technology lagged decades behind the West. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union imported grain despite vast farmland. And once a superpower imports basic necessities, the system loses the option of insulating citizens from global price pressure. Central planning suppressed incentives, and innovation withered. Stage 3 emerged quietly. The ruble was not trusted internationally or domestically, and hard currency was required for foreign goods. Gold and oil financed imports because no one demanded rubles. When oil prices dropped in 1985, reserves dwindled. Real money ran out. And once real money ran out, the state lost the option of buying time through external purchases. The next constraint followed immediately. Shortages stopped being episodic and became structural, forcing political stress to rise without a financial release valve. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and Eastern European satellites departed in rapid succession. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany left within a year. Strategic depth vanished. And once depth vanished, the Soviet Union lost the buffer that justified its military posture. The Soviet state lacked funds to enforce cohesion. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, 900 days from the wall's fall to total disappearance. No invasion compelled it. Economic implosion rendered the military unpaid, and the government inert. The pattern completed its arc again, and once completed, the option of gradual reform ended because there was no longer a state capable of carrying it out. Now the United States is operating inside that sequence, which means the next stages are not theoretical comparisons, but structural continuations. This is not an early warning phase, it is a late structural phase, where reversal costs more than prevention did. Stage 1 is military overextension. More than 750 military bases across 80 countries with troops in 150 nations. Defense commitments through NATO, alliances in Asia, presence in the Middle East, deterrence against China and Russia. An annual military budget of $850 billion, exceeding the next 10 countries combined. Yet recruitment declines, equipment ages, and simultaneous crises exceed capacity. Each renewal of that global reach commits the next budget before it is written, which means the next crisis must be handled with capacity already pledged. The immediate constraint follows from that posture. When new threats appear, the system cannot create fresh capacity. It can only stretch what already exists. Stage 2 is currency debasement. In 1971, the gold window closed and the dollar became fiat. Since 2000, the money supply expanded 400%, and since 2020, over $6 trillion have been created. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. The method differs from mixing copper into silver, but the effect converges. More units chase the same output. Debasement secures present solvency by committing future purchasing power, which means maintaining the same level of services requires progressively larger nominal spending. The downstream constraint appears immediately. Higher nominal spending becomes mandatory just to maintain existing services, which pushes the system toward larger deficits before any new program is even proposed. Stage 3 is the debt spiral. $36 trillion in federal debt, roughly 120% of GDP. Interest payments approaching $1 trillion annually, exceeding defense spending. Deficits of $1.8 trillion in 2024 during economic expansion. Borrowing to pay interest on prior borrowing. As obligations compound, balanced budgets cease to be a policy choice and become a structural impossibility, without cuts large enough to disrupt the system they are meant to preserve. Spain defaulted. Britain borrowed until it relinquished empire. The Soviet Union exhausted reserves. The arithmetic follows regardless of ideology, and the immediate constraint is that future budgets begin under mandatory interest pressure that cannot be voted away without consequences that exceed any short-term relief. Stage 4 is loss of productive capacity, where manufacturing has been hollowed out. Production shifted to China, Mexico, Vietnam. An annual trade deficit of $800 billion. Dependence on foreign supply chains for medicine, electronics, steel, even military components. Dollars flow outward in exchange for goods while domestic output contracts. Like Spain importing with American silver, the United States consumes what it does not produce, which means restoring capacity would require time and capital already absorbed by debt and defense. And once production is lost, rebuilding cannot happen at the speed crises demand. The downstream constraint follows immediately. When supply chains tighten, the state cannot surge output domestically. It can only compete for imports using a currency whose external desirability is already under strain. Stage 5 is social decay. Trust in institutions at historic lows, with crime rising and homelessness increasing. 100,000 annual drug overdose deaths and fertility rates collapsing. Political paralysis entrenched. Infrastructure projects stall. Policy disputes freeze reform. Talent disengages or departs. The signals accumulate, while official narratives insist stability persists. And once trust collapses, even competent policy becomes harder to execute because compliance and patience evaporate. Each year correction is deferred. The policy adjustments required become larger and politically harder, reducing the number of reforms that can be executed without destabilizing the system. The Soviet Union reached stage 5 before dissolution. Britain reached stage 5 before relinquished empire. Spain endured longer but followed the same arc. Stage 6 in every case was loss of reserve currency status. When allies diversify holdings, when trade shifts to alternatives, when the dominant currency flows back because foreign demand weakens, the leverage that financed deficits evaporates. And once that leverage evaporates, domestic stabilization becomes more expensive because external demand no longer absorbs the overflow. Early indicators appear. BRICS exploring alternatives. Central banks increasing gold reserves. China and Russia settling trade in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia accepting yuan for oil. Each alternative transaction reduces the automatic demand for dollars, which means future deficits must be financed either at higher cost or through greater internal absorption. Once external absorption weakens, domestic trade-offs accelerate. Stage 7 is collapse, and by the time it arrives, the mechanisms that could have prevented it have already been exhausted. Not slow decline, but rapid implosion. The Soviet Union vanished in 900 days. Britain surrendered empire within 2 decades of financial exhaustion. Spain's decline stretched longer but never reversed. When the reserve currency fails, when debt exceeds repayment capacity, when military funding cannot be sustained, the system does not glide downward. It fractures. A currency crisis triggers a debt crisis, which triggers political crisis. The superpower becomes a cautionary tale, and the reserve currency becomes regional. The empire becomes memory. And once the fracture begins, the option of orderly sequencing disappears, because each crisis accelerates the next. At that point, the system can no longer choose which crisis to handle first, because handling one forces the next into motion. 3 empires followed this pattern. Each believed itself exceptional, and each assumed rules bent around its power. Each postponed correction until options narrowed beyond retrieval. The pattern is not emotional, it is mathematical. You cannot spend beyond means indefinitely, and you cannot sustain empire without production. You cannot debase currency without consequence. Once stages 1 through 5 are complete, stages 6 and 7 emerge from constraint rather than choice. And once emergence begins, the remaining decisions become about managing the speed of loss rather than avoiding it. Since 2020, the United States has accelerated through the stages. Money creation increased, debt expanded, and military commitments deepened. Production hollowed further and social cohesion fractured. With every stage intensifying simultaneously, correcting one imbalance now worsens another, which means adjustment requires accepting pain across multiple fronts at once. Perhaps reform will intervene. Perhaps policy will reverse course. But history shows that reform becomes hardest when it is most necessary, because admitting the stage requires relinquishing the illusion of control. And once the illusion is surrendered, the institutions must confront obligations they can no longer pretend are optional. If you want to understand what happens when stage 6 arrives, when reserve currency status erodes visibly, and when stage 7 begins, the sequence has already been written in Spain, in Britain, in the Soviet Union. The answers are not hidden in the future, they are embedded in the past. And the pattern says America is now at stage 5, moving forward under its own accumulated decisions toward whatever stage 6 and 7 will demand.